So good afternoon. My name's Alan Davies. I'm Director of Digital at the Innovation Agency, which is the Northwest Coast HSN. And today, this afternoon rather, we're going to explore a couple of really interesting topics. I'm really privileged to have Chris Viner from E.ON and Scott Watson here physically. And via the joys of cyber technology, Shal Shutner from Glasgow is going to talk to us via a video. We're going to explore a couple of interesting topics. The first, via Chris, is more about how a managed service provider or a managed energy provider like E.ON can get involved and support society to manage better in terms of its care, so that citizen-powered agenda. And Chris is going to unpack that for us in a minute and take us through it. Secondly, but not quite in sequence, Chal is going to, from Scotland, talk a little bit about what we've been doing at the Digital Health and Care Institute in Scotland around empowering data, around the capabilities for the citizen to own their own data, to have more control of their own data, and to work with the system in a different way than we do today in many of our health and care environments. And Scott's going to take that home with the fantastic work that's going on in Greater Manchester around the local health and care record exemplar and what we're doing in terms of interoperability there, but with very much a citizen-centred, citizen-powered slant. That will leave us, hopefully, according to plan, with 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A, and I did have some pre-questions, but bearing in mind there's just a few of us, I think let's have an interactive conversation about what we hear, and let's bring out some of the references. I can see Janet in the audience, I know Janet well, so pokers from a Lancashire South Cumbria perspective, and I would encourage all the rest of you as well, let's have an interactive conversation about the art of the possible and about what we've been able to achieve here today. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chris to talk a bit about E.ON and where we're going with there. We'll have a sit down over here, Chris, for a minute.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. So I started in this role some 18 months ago now, and at the time, my director asked me to explore the possibility of us looking to join the silos between energy efficiency and health, because a lot of the delivery that we do actually has indirect benefits from a health perspective. And I think we've tried to break down silos in the past, but always struggled. And we've seen a significant movement over the last sort of 18 months, mostly because the conversation's been slightly different. So just to give you a bit of context behind it, most people already live in their homes in the UK. The last thing they want to do is lose their memories and move out. They want to stay in their homes for longer and be independent in their homes for longer. And some of these statistics here, some of you will probably be well versed with them. But in England alone, we've got over 24 million homes, 56 million people. And most of the homes are already built and will stay from one year to the next. 10% of English homes have a Category 1 hazard. Category 1 hazard is a matrix that the Building Research Establishment use, and it allows them to identify some of the key hazards within the home that potentially might cause some sort of issue for that individual and potentially be admitted to hospital for whatever reason. And so within the health sector, the BRE did a publication on poor housing, and they've put out a forecast of 1.4 billion that the NHS could actually save on admissions to hospital through improved housing across the UK. Two of the key fundamentals in there are around excess cold and frailty, which you can see there are significant numbers. And a number that's quite frequently bounced about at the moment is for every £1 you invest, it delivers £3.70 savings. I've actually seen that number now quoted by the NHS at £15. For every £1 you spend, it is potentially achieving £15 savings, which is significant, it's huge. And that's all from a proactive rather than a reactive stance, and that's essentially what we're trying to do. One of my key clients that I'm working with at the moment, we're working with 5 county councils across the Midlands, and one of them that's live at the moment is with Staffordshire County Council. And I'll go on to explain the kind of consultant that we have there at the moment. But essentially, by working with the CCG, they've pulled together a risk stratification of frailty across Staffordshire. And you can see the numbers there. From a moderate frailty perspective of population over 65, it's 12%, so nearly 22,000 residents. They believe that those residents, within a 12-month period, are highly likely to be admitted to hospital. And what they want to do is try and reduce that. And most of that is essentially those people in their homes and enabling them to be independent for longer and not having these falls. Now, finally, from a budgetary side of things, in the public sector, you're probably all aware of the Better Care Fund, which is a significant amount of money, mostly spent on a kind of reactive spend. In particular, a good one to highlight is Disabled Facilities Grant. So it takes someone to fall over and break their hip, become disabled before they can have some support in their home to have it more adequately suitable to what their needs are, despite potentially them being frail previously. And then in the private sector, we as a supplier market, the whole market spends £640 million per annum on what's called the Energy Company Obligation, and that's delivering energy efficiency measures into people's homes. To put it into context, E.ON spend £80 million a year on physical measures in people's homes to improve the energy efficiency of those properties. There's also Warm Home Discount, which is another circa 50 million per year. And then there's also this external fund that we work to gain access to through the county councils, which is called the Warm Homes Fund. And that is a fund to support vulnerable residents across the UK, supporting up to £150 million worth of spend up to 2022. So hopefully that gives you a bit of context. One of the key clients that I'm working with at the moment is Staffordshire County Council. And within the County Council, we've got a consortium that we've formulated. And this is how we join this up together. Because a consortium way of working is how we improve and knock down those silos, but also reduce cost. Because there's lots of efficiencies that we create through this process. One being lead generation. From our perspective, when we go out and we want to deliver these measures in the market, we've got to find these individuals first. And a lot of them are actually very hard to find, and they're not that well known to the public sector, nor the private sector. So we're working with Staffordshire County Council. They have all the district councils that work in the background, as well as obviously ourselves, Beat the Cold and Marches Energy Agency, which are the independent charities local to the area, absolutely fundamental as part of this process, well recognised by the residents within the county area. And then in the background, the housing associations as well, which again, a lot of these residents potentially live in those properties. The Staffordshire Warmer Homes scheme is a £4 million scheme where we're looking to deliver over 1,000 boiler installations across the county between now and the end of 2021. It's match funded by both E.ON and the Warm Homes Fund. And it provides significant improvements for these individuals in terms of their back pocket bill saving, but also the improvement within their property in terms of having a warm home for them. Throughout the delivery of the programme, we've done it logistically, intentionally, so that we start off in a smaller area and start to spread out as we go through the programme. And I've just put one typical case study there as an example, just to put it into context, the types of people that we're delivering to here. So this little family on the right-hand side here, this lady has a severely disabled child, and they were going through a Disabled Facilities Grant at the time application. Now, we fast-tracked them through the process, and we got them a first-time central heating system installed into their property. Previously, they were heating their home with electric panel heaters and a gas room fire. We got the installation complete. They finished off their Disabled Facilities Grant, and then we followed up with what's called a Category 3 assessment. And the Category 3 assessment is carried out by Beat the Cold, the charity, with one of my colleagues. And we go into the property and do an assessment of the individual to understand what their needs are. They look at things like their energy costs, they look at their benefits, and they look at how they can maximise their income within the home. Of course, she was on the correct benefits, which was great to see. But she was heating her home with gas fires and electric panel heaters. She was spending £288 a month on energy, which is an incredible amount of money. Through the installation of the new A-rated gas boiler and a fuel switch, we actually got her direct debit down to £77 a month, which was literally life-changing to the individual, and she burst into tears. Now, this is just a typical example of the types of people that we go into, and this is where the charities involved are absolutely essential, because that one-to-one connection is really, really important to them. The challenge with this, though, is that what we're doing within the market from an energy efficiency perspective only goes so far. What we're doing, if you look at it from a Maslow's hierarchy of needs perspective, is we're tackling a lot of the physical needs at the bottom. Now, what potentially happens is we address that physical need. So as an example, a frail individual might be struggling to move around their home. They might be cold, and that's not helping with their frailty. We might improve the heat of that home, or it might be an individual who has COPD. By installing that central heating system, that improves their health condition. However, 2 days later, if they fall over and break their hip and be admitted to hospital, that's a complete wasted opportunity for that individual. We could have provided more support or connected them with someone else who could have helped them during that situation. Another really good example is if they've got COPD, and as part of that condition, their access and connection to the community is through things like GP appointments, hospital appointments, going to community things, and we potentially make them that independent in their home at this point that all of a sudden they don't need to leave their house anymore. So the next thing it then turns to is social isolation. And when social isolation kicks in, people become unaware, and the people in the sector just don't understand where those individuals are, and you're not able to contact them and help them, and all of a sudden they degrade even more and more. So we try to look at this as part of a Maslow's hierarchy of needs perspective, and in order to achieve that personal fulfillment at the top, to get that independence, there's lots more that we need to do other than just the physical needs. So to explain how this kind of works, from our perspective, we see it as a bit of a siloed puzzle right now. And what we're delivering at scale is improvements in fuel poverty, environment, and excess cold. Now, we've got budget, we spend budget there, and as I said earlier, we know we spend quite a lot of money in that sector, but it doesn't fulfill their whole needs. Another really important element right now is loneliness. So loneliness is becoming more and more apparent. There's now an MP for loneliness in central government, and these charities here connect the dots between that and help quite significantly. But it's still quite a siloed sector. You've then obviously got cognitive impairment and frailty, which is more of a reactive approach. And then kind of in the middle, you've got safety, digital, personal confidence, linking that together. So within Staffordshire, we're working with lots of different organisations, including the fire service and the police, to try and bring that together. Hopefully, by bringing that puzzle together, you then get the personal confidence. But the bit I want to talk about and lead on to these next guys is the digital element of it is really, really important, because if we go in and improve all these little bits of this puzzle, but don't digitally enable it, it will end. And it won't be sustainable long term. It'll be a very short-term shelf life. So we're trying to make sure that we encapsulate that digital element of it. Now, to put things in perspective, the way we look at this is not what the customer necessarily needs, it's what the customer wants. Because if you tell a customer they need this, they're not always going to want to do anything about it. Whereas what we're doing is we're going out to the customers and understanding what it is that they want. It's like a flat screen TV in someone's home. You know, people have it because they want it, not necessarily because they can afford it. So we take the customer right at the heart, and the important thing that we're trying to reflect here is it's not necessarily about one segment and one individual. You're aging right from the time that you're born. So from our perspective, we need to be looking at all these different types of demographics and ages within the individual. So I've tried to kind of put 3 there for you to just get a feel for that. Now, if you look at this in 4 segments, to the left-hand side, you've got digital expectations. All 3 of those different demographics have digital expectations, and it's moving greater and greater by the day. I can probably guarantee that most of you in this room probably have a smartphone, and as part of that smartphone, you expect things to be at the press of a button, and you want it to be at the press of a button. Insurance, security, prescriptions, managing bills, home management, all that you want at a touch of a button. It's ease, it's what you want. Secondly, mental health is also really, really important, and from a digital point of view, you've got things like social connections, so social media, attending community events, and hopefully what that does is that starts to remove that social isolation element of it. You've got things like connected care, personalised service, and even memories, photos. That does a massive amount for people, particularly older people. Then the 3rd segment is multi-generational homes, and this kind of picks up the point that I started off with in terms of context. Now, what I mean by this is people want to stay in their homes for longer, so we need to design homes so that people can stay in their homes for longer, and we also need to retrofit homes, existing homes, so that they can stay in there for longer. So there's things like multi-generational kitchens now. There's things around sustainability of that home, so adaptable appliances, renewable heat pumps, insulation EV charging points, you know, even just as basic as an A-rated gas boiler. Now, those elements are really, really important, but none of it can happen unless you have the digital infrastructure behind it, and that's what these guys are then going to start to pull on. From a digital infrastructure side of things, the types of things that we do in particular and what we're looking into more and more is around things like smart meters. So ultra-fast broadband now, you just expect it. You know, 10 years ago, we probably would have been thinking, yeah, it should be coming soon. Now you expect it. Our children wouldn't know what to do without Wi-Fi. Sensors in the home, voice control, and controlled appliances. So what we're trying to do is trying to collaborate and bring all this together into kind of one central hub whereby an individual has access to be able to use all this. And from our perspective, we kind of see it as a digital platform. So we're going through a process at the moment of designing what this prototype might look like, and we're testing it with customers in the market to understand what their wants are. All this information that you can see in front of you here is based on direct customer interviews where they've turned around to us and said, oh, I want X, Y, and Z, but I don't want this. And quite often, it's when you tell them they need something, they don't want it. A really good example is Kerry, who works for me, went out and did a whole load of these interviews, and one elderly lady that she spoke to at a dance meeting, she did an interview with her, and as part of that process, she said, how engaged are you with digital products? Do you have a smartphone, etc.? Oh, no, don't get involved in digital. This not for me, not my generation. And at the end of the interview, she pulled out this huge bag, and Kerry said, what's that huge bag for? What have you got in there? And she pulled out an iPad. And her iPad was it was literally her world. It had all her social connections on there, had her photos on there, had means and ways she can contact her family. It was effectively how we use a smartphone today, but she was using it on an iPad. And this individual, when she asked more clarity about kind of how she's using it and why she's using it, it was her family members that bought it for her, and she influenced her to use that product. And that's why I kind of use these 3 demographics here, is because for us to tackle this improvement and digital enabling within the older generation, we need to influence them by our own personal needs for our own personal family. And that's how we feel we'll be able to tackle that sector. And that's everything from me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks very much, Chris. We'll come back to some questions about that maybe a little bit later, hopefully a little bit later. But it's exciting to see a big player like E.ON moving into this space and very much in line with our citizen agenda. So next, I'm going to, unfortunately, Shal can't join us from Glasgow, but he's sent a video to explain a little bit about what the Digital Health and Care Institute is doing around citizen-powered data. So to our AV team at the back, can you kick it up for us? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Chandler Achute. I'm the Chief Technology Officer with the DHI. We are the Digital Health and Care Innovation Centre funded by the Scottish Government. Today I'm going to talk to you about untethered data sharing. Just so we're clear on what I mean by that, tethered data sharing is when an organisation, usually a health and care provider, holds a clinical record and gives you access or some edit control over it. When we talk about untethered data sharing, by that I mean you holding your own data and having full agency and control over it, and making that available to third parties to offer you services. Just going to spend a bit of time today talking to you about some key digital consumer trends and trying to get people used to the idea that we are increasingly working in untethered ways. The first major one I want to talk about is open banking. So by no means an open banking expert, but the basic concept behind open banking was that people were no longer wanting to consume all of their financial services through one institution anymore. So you would want your mortgage from one provider and your car loan from another and your credit card from another again. People wanted the best in breed products of each type, and wanted those things to interact. So gone are the days of one big bank with a manager that does everything for you. But the issue in that model was that these large banking institutions were kind of sitting on your data, and it was hard to manifest any kind of integration or value from your data in that model. So open banking comes along with government regulation, and effectively enforces open platform kind of principles, meaning that if you want, you can consent to a third party business and app provider connecting to the open banking API, and with your consent they can use your banking data to offer you a different service. So that might be, for example, something like Money Dashboard, which connects a range of accounts from credit cards to current accounts to loans and shows you all of your financial information in one user interface instead of you having to log into many. The second main consumer trend is around password management. So the idea, of something like Keychain or LastPass, are password managers that your browser does this as well. You would remember passwords for you and allow you to reuse those passwords easily and effortlessly to kind of smooth your digital experiences. Dashlane is one we use for demo purposes quite a lot because it goes beyond simple password management and also remembers the details you put into web forms, your usernames, your addresses, your various personal details, date of birth, etc., and also payment information and various other bits and pieces, and allows you to automatically log in or auto-populate forms all the time. And people are increasingly happy with this kind of service, and it helps you kind of keep control of your digital assets, and removes a lot of friction in your online experiences. So, I guess what we're going to reflect on here is the idea that some of those things we just described. So, two big moving parts there are the emergence of open platforms and the idea that I, as a user, have active control over my own data, and the second one being that I can manage my own personal data without necessarily administrating it. And a lot of times in healthcare, we don't think people are capable of managing their own personal data, but the reality is it's just about getting the medium right. If we're offered some convenience, if we're offered low friction, if we're offered automation, people will happily manage their own personal data if they see some benefit from doing so. So instead of getting people to manage their health data for their own good, what we're saying is understanding and aligning to the world in which they live and the services they use, and figuring out how to sort of almost capture that data as a byproduct of what they would normally do, and then allow them to reuse it to speed up processes in the future. So, in a health and care context, what DHI has been working on is understanding how we'd replicate that in a health context specifically. So the kind of work we've done, this is just a quick taster today, just to kind of give you a flavour for the kind of thing that we do. We have effectively kind of implemented an equivalent of that open banking kind of approach, and an equivalent of that personally held record, that personal data store approach. And so what you see in this diagram is, in the middle there, we're working with a company called Storm ID, which is a SME based in Scotland, and we've developed this open platform. And effectively, it's a kind of digital switchboard. Uses fire messaging predominantly, and you have an account with it. You kind of log in using OpenID, and you can share data from any parties that connect into that platform. And the platform offers open APIs to other developers. So the only way data can move through this system is through the user's active consent. You are controlling the data. And you see on the right-hand side, we've got the personal data store. So that's provided by Midex, a community interest company based in Scotland. And they are a community interest company, so non-commercial they will not monetize your data. They work on an asset locked basis, meaning that Google can't come along and buy them and get your data that way. And they work on a zero knowledge basis, so the data that's in your personal data store they cannot see no matter who asks. And so that's the kind of the bucket where we want the data to be stored, and that's an untethered data sharing infrastructure that means that you're not beholden to a government or commercial provider in order to access and gain value from the data that you provide or hold. And then with those two fundamental components, that open platform and that personal data store, we then experiment with all the different ways that we can manifest value. The first one was saying, all right, well, DHI acting in the role as a trust broker. So there's nothing inherent about this system that's open other than DHI is, as a public body, choosing to run it on an open basis, on a person-centered basis. We are trusted by the NHS, so we were allowed to integrate with NHS Great Glasgow and Clyde's record systems, Sky Store, Docman Track, and other things to get appointment details, diagnosis, medications, etc. And again, that's using fire messaging predominantly. And we link that to the My Account sort of login the Glasgow uses, and the KI number in Scotland as that unique identifier. And then we connect into Apple Health Kit in the top right. So the idea being we want to go where the energy is. What are people already using to collect blood pressure, weight, sleep, kind of these sorts of metrics, which will increasingly be used to allow us to predict and personalize services. So effectively, if HealthKit can do it, we can do it. That was a very specific choice on our part, rather than connecting a whole bunch of stuff directly ourselves. And then lastly, up in the top left, you'll see this kind of care coordination tools piece. And that is us basically saying that we can manifest the data from this anywhere. And so we've connected a third piece from a company called SiteKit, and they run eRedbook across England at the moment. And we're basically saying, in this context, we could manifest the data with the user's consent to this third party from HealthKit, from the blood pressure tools, from the personal data store, from the clinical record systems, from ARMED, which is a kind of a falls prevention tool. And we can manifest that data into a social feed, a group of people that the person might gather, like a WhatsApp group, and allow them to feed prompts and rules based data into their conversation, so that when the appointment comes through for the person, their carer will know and their neighbour will know as a matter of course. Or when the person's having a bad time sleeping, that will manifest in the conversation and act as a prompt for kind of group action. And the idea being for someone who might be frail, wanting to stay independent, you can curate your own data, curate your own circle of care, and then use that to empower yourself and your circle to coordinate better. And then in time, that data could be used using machine learning and other kind of techniques to identify risk and compare it and maybe signpost to you proactively into your messaging feed, rather than getting you to come and log into an NHS portal in some other part of the internet. So we just wanted to show you that today, just to give you a flavour for what we're about. We've been funded by Scottish Government. This was the alpha. We've been funded by Scottish Government to do another 5 years' work. So we will be reprocuring a lot of the infrastructure and expanding this over the next few years. So if anyone's interested, get in touch with the organisers. I'm sure they'll put you through to us. Thanks very much.
Not too bad timing-wise. Sorry about the sound quality on that. I hadn't appreciated it was going to be quite as poor over the speakers. Charles just talked a bit about what's going on in Glasgow there, and you'll see in a minute when Scott comes up that Great Minds Think Alike, Greater Manchester is doing something similar. For those who haven't picked it up there, that MyDex data store is not owned by the state. The NHS, local authorities, nope. It's actually in a trust for the public. So it means governments can come and go, policies can come and go, but that data is secure. It's within the control of the individual citizen. And that starts a different type of conversation and builds a different level of trust in all of us as citizens, allowing our data to be used. So it's quite an interesting innovation. Now, with that in mind, let me introduce Scott, who's going to come talk to us about the work that's going on in Greater Manchester. Thanks very much, Scott.
Thank you, Alan. So just briefly, a little bit about myself. I'm the technical lead for the Greater Manchester Longitudinal Healthcare Record Platform, which is known as LICRA, which is an unfortunate turn of phrase. When you not generally get up in front of people and say you work in LICRA, they ask if you know Bradley Wiggins. But fundamentally, I work out of Salford Royal, and the nature of LICRA itself is around joining up and doing all the digital plumbing and connecting the healthcare system up. And the view across from NHS England is to have this program to be able to cover across 13 different areas across England with an eventuality of having everything sort of connect up. So some of the things that I want to talk about really is around some of the challenges and how this concept of having citizen-held data and citizen-controlled data can help address some of these. So at the moment within the NHS, you've got quite an extensive sort of history of clinical systems and different environments. We seem to reconfigure the health environment every few years, sometimes aligned with a change of government. But fundamentally, you have an environment where you have data that sits in organizational silos or system silos. So I used to work at Central Manchester Foundation Trust many years ago, and when we did an audit across our trust, it was a large acute trust at the time, it's larger now. But when we did an audit across our clinical systems, we had about 650 clinical systems that were holding patient data. Now, some of those systems might have been an Access database that some consultant's nephew wrote for him in the holidays. Some of those were mature systems, but they could age from anywhere from things that were designed and engineered in the 80s, things like the patient administration systems. But the one thing that was very, very challenging was the fact that they were all data silos, and you used a mechanism to be able to share information, which was predominantly around using messaging, I think called HL7. And that's how things have been done in the NHS. But the concept is that you end up replicating your data. So, for example, if you had some blood work done within a laboratory, that result would come from the laboratory, go back to, say, the acute systems, Orticom system. Then a copy of that might go out to the GP. It might go into other care settings as well. So you ended up replicating all this data, and that sort of provenance of the information is sometimes lost. The other challenge that we have within the healthcare system is around information governance. Now, we should all be sort of protecting data, using it appropriately, etc. But information governance and who actually owns the data is a conversation, an ongoing conversation across the NHS. It's very clear within legislation. It's very clear when you read the words of Dame Fiona Caldicott that we're supposed to be sharing information for direct care, but sometimes on the ground it doesn't quite translate to that. But fundamentally, coming back to the citizen focus, because of this complexity and the fact that the data is distributed in these silos, the challenges around information governance, and you're connecting the data up across using messaging, you end up in an environment where if we continue down this path, that you'll end up with a hairball type architecture. And I wouldn't say that's the current map within Greater Manchester, but if we continue doing what we're doing currently for the next 20 years, it'll probably look like that. But it's next to impossible to be able to have a citizen-centric view of this information and bring it all together. And I think within the NHS, sometimes people sort of struggle a little bit with the idea of what the NHS is and comprehension of the size. The NHS is the 5th largest organisation by workforce on the planet, the first two being the American military, and then followed by the People's Republic of China. I think Walmart and McDonald's are positions 3 and 4. So we have a very sort of diverse landscape within the NHS once again around the digital maturity at different layers and different levels. But fundamentally how this sort of translates is that most of you, if you touch upon the care system in some way, shape or form, it's very, very likely that you've had to repeat your story. All that information has been available in different care settings. It's not that the individuals that you may be are going to see within the services don't care. It's not necessarily that the actual quality of care is compromised. But the fact is that you still have some information sitting on paper, and where there is digital systems, they're not necessarily connected up across a system. And within Greater Manchester, the work that I'm doing, we up at that sort of 10,000-foot view. So we're looking at the entire locality. And it's not just about making sure that a hospital is efficient, or you get discharged very quickly from an acute hospital and back into primary care or into community. It's about those challenges across the different services, and also the way that we need to consume services, how we need to commission services. All of that's going to change. So this gentleman here, hopefully people know who he is. This is Sir Tim Berners-Lee, and he invented the World Wide Web, which we're all hopefully very familiar with. But fundamentally, the concept of the web of having distributed knowledge was one of his main visions. And the way that things have sort of evolved since the sort of .com sort of bubble back in 2000, around that era, is that the tech giants have spent their time aggregating data and then taking that data and leveraging value from that. And that really wasn't within the principles of what Sir Tim sort of outlined when he created the World Wide Web. So myself and a colleague, Stephen Dobson, who's a Chief Digital Officer at the Greater Manchester Health Social Care Partnership, we contacted the company that Sir Tim heads up with a gentleman by the name of John Bruce, just to sort of explore some of the things that they're doing around this concept of citizen-held records or citizen-held data. And they've got a technology called Solid. Now, Solid is an open source technology. You can jump on their website, download it, and have a play. But if you're going to do that, you'll have to be very, very technical, and it's not really something that's ready for prime time. But fundamentally, as a vision, the vision is sound. So what Solid have done, Inrupt have done, is they've started to think, well, if we need to get this beyond the open source sort of experimentations type phase, we need to start working with industry partners, working with different sectors, where the pattern for solving this particular problem, there's a use case for it, there's a need. So one of the Inrupt partners is a company called Genera Digital. And we approached them late last year. We had a workshop with them to see what the art of the possible was. But fundamentally, the best way to think of a pod is that, similar to the decentralization of the web, it's a mechanism to be able to have distributed data and have that data under control of the citizens who have these pods. So a pod in itself, it can be a little bit difficult to explain, but fundamentally it's like a database, but it's a database that you have full control over, and it's like a data enclave. But it's decoupled from the applications that you particularly that you use. So, for example, if you look at something like Facebook, where many people put a lot of information into Facebook, all that data sits within Facebook servers, and they provide the service on top of it that we all interact with. The concept is, if you used a pod, is that the data would go into your repository, which you could host wherever you wanted to. If you're part of the Apple ecosphere, you might put it in iCloud. If you're part of the Google environment, you might put it within your Google environment, or you might want to store it at home on a personal device. But the concept is that you would have that ability to take that data and move it. But then if you said, well, I don't want to be using Facebook anymore, I want to use another social media provider, you'll be able to plug that into that same data. So you're decoupling your data from your service and from the systems. And it takes a little while to sort of get the concept of it, but it's quite liberating when you start flipping this around and start thinking about this within the NHS and the potential services that you can build on top of this. The concept with a pod is you could have as many as you like. You're not just limited to one. You could have one that is your health data, you could have another one that's your finance data, or you could have one that's your energy data, or you could bring these things together. But because you have control over those particular data enclaves, you also have that ability to have another service come along and add value, and you would be explicit in granting access to that particular information. So fundamentally, your pod becomes your master record. So another example would be if you, how many times have we had to update our address or our phone number with different systems? We have sort of like breadcrumbs scattered through time about all the different services that we've necessarily interacted with. And that data is sitting in a database somewhere. If we go change address or change phone number, you can't just hit a button and then have all those systems updated. You also can't just hit a button, even though under GDPR we're allowed to, hit a button and just have data that expires and say, well, I gave you that information 10 years ago, you don't have access to it anymore. If you put the data into a pod, you would have that ability. You could time limit who has access to it and for how long, but also you have one master copy of it. So if you had thousands of different applications and services that are accessing that pod, when you update it, you are updating the master copy. And more importantly, you can revoke that and you can control it. And you also have the ability to see a full audit of who's accessing it and why. So for us, within the LICRA program, we are quite excited by the pods for, from a person perspective around that sort of capability they can give you, but also the ability to be able to try and address some of this information sharing challenges that we have within the NHS. So benefits of citizen-controlled data. The big one, tell your story once and control who can view. This is the top thing that always comes out when we engage with citizens and patients across the system. The amount of times that we have to repeat ourselves. And we don't always get the story right. It can be very complex. If you've got a lot of comorbidities and complex clinical history, and you're sitting in front of a GP or a consultant for 10 minutes, you're not necessarily conveying that information as well as potentially you could, and especially if your condition is affecting you in some way, shape, or form, it makes that difficult. Any healthcare setting, you'll always have access to critical information. So at the moment, if you have, say, I don't know, say maybe you're unfortunate, you're currently under chemotherapy because you've got cancer, that information is critical in an acute setting. So no matter where you are in the country, or even if you're not in the country, if you had that information available to you within your data enclave, within your pod, and you could be able to show that, that could potentially have life-saving impact on you. Providing access to your family or friends to support your care. So for example, within Greater Manchester, the clinical use cases that we're proving our technology on is clinical frailty and living with dementia. And the circle of people that support that sort of cohort of citizens can be quite diverse, but you don't want to be able to be in a position to say, well, maybe your neighbor drives you to your appointments, your outpatient appointments. So they need to see the calendar and they need to see some of the key things around your appointment, but they don't need to see everything else in your record. If you've got that data stored within a pod, you can control who accesses it and under what conditions, and once again, be able to sort of revoke it. The thing for me that is really the eye-opener was that ability to address that sharing challenge. So if we, instead of storing this information in new silos, new applications, we could go and swap out every clinical system within the NHS and put a new one in. If it's still that same sort of pattern, we're just storing the data within other new silos, even if we standardize the way that information can be accessed using standards and standard access patterns for that. I mentioned the full audit access, who has access and to what and why they're accessing your information. And also to be able to connect your data to other things like transport and utilities and finance. And that is where other sort of opportunities come at play, where people can say, offer you different services to improve your health or well-being, or improve your financial situation. Chris was talking about some of the benefits around sort of addressing your utility usage, etc. Things like clinical frailty are really impacted by the wider determinants of health and not necessarily within the healthcare system. So for example, there are three main things that contribute to you going up a frailty spectrum are poor hydration, lack of nutrition, and social isolation. It's important that when people are making decisions around changing transport, bus routes, etc., that those sorts of things be taken into consideration. But being able to also access that data within your pod and have someone contact you either electronically through a mechanism to be able to utilize that data should be the conversation. It shouldn't be just something that's happening in the background. It should be something that's quite explicit. And most importantly, your data is not tied to a system or an application or a service. For those that do have smartphones, we all have many, many apps on there. And those apps evolve, those apps depreciate, they change. What we should be doing ideally is if we decouple our data so that we're not locked into those proprietary applications, then it creates this ecosystem where people, with our permission, can interact with our data and opens up those opportunities to innovate a lot more quickly within the NHS. Just as a very brief example, we did a calculation on when we're looking at our clinical use cases within Greater Manchester. I did a calculation of doing sort of custom development within our core product that's used across Greater Manchester. And if we allowed 6 months for each functional area, we'd be developing for the next 34 years just on that one product to address the challenges. We need to be able to liberate the system, but if we're going to liberate the system, the citizens have to be in control. So on the final slide, just a few things. I don't do Twitter, I'm sorry. It feels too much like a job to me. My contact details are on there as far as LinkedIn is concerned. That's probably the best way. And also, I did a little bit of a mash-up. All these slides weren't mine. The INRUPT slides, there's a link to INRUPT there. There's also a good video on YouTube just as an introduction to INRUPT. It's quite an interesting sort of concept, and I have been fortunate enough to have a conversation with Sir Tim Berners-Lee and explain what we're doing within the NHS, and he's quite excited by it. And Genera Digital's the link that's on there as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott. Don't think we need that, actually. We'll just stick it over to the next slide. Okay. Got about 10 minutes left. So we've heard from three speakers. Chris talking from Eon, Chal from Department of Health and Care, Digital Health and Care Institute in Glasgow, and obviously Scott from Greater Manchester. Common theme in terms of citizen-powered community. Eon taking a fantastic leading role around warmth and frailty and connective platform. Both Chal and Scott both talking about the power of citizen data and giving them the tools and the capability to take control of that and for it to be used in a much broader setting than just health and care. I was privileged to visit Estonia earlier on this year with an NHS delegation, and they've got something over there called the X Road. And I was sharing with Scott and Chris earlier, a gentleman who was showing us around was able to show his personal record. And his personal record within the state of Estonia had health, care, banking, transport, the whole shebang. And he personally had the capability to lock or unlock that for different services within the community, miles away from where we are. But maybe something we could look at and aspire to in going forwards. And when I think about the context today at the TSA conference, where we're talking about technology-enabled care, the long journey of telecare over its decades, etc., maybe we're moving ever closer towards a citizen-powered community where all of these tools and all of this information can be pulled together for the benefit of you and I as individuals. So, with that as a context, I did have some questions, but I'd rather just ask you. What would you like to ask us? Or what would you like to share in terms of comments? Anybody got any questions or comments, please? Go on, you can't be that stunned. Hey, oh, get one there and one there, please. Thank you.
Sorry, it's just...
Go ahead.
I was trying to understand the diagram that you had, the DHI exchange layer, and then you had the bits coming out. And you had it linked with the health kit and the armed. As my understanding is that all those ones coming out, excuse my ignorance here, was that they can actually be part of it and tap into it, opposed to each one of them having their own separate entity and then having their own data system. Would that be right? So
that diagram that Chal was showing, you're not far off, had the normal health and care world in the bottom left-hand corner. Okay, so the sort of Glasgow and Strathclyde, here we go, we're going backwards, health board. So that's the traditional world of electronic patient records. But combined with that, through the DHI exchange layer, which Storm ID is the company that provides that, they're acting as a broker to connect up data that could come from patient tools, data that could come from care coordination tools on the top left-hand side. We had Armed, which was a frailty app. Yeah, and we had anything that Apple Health Kit can provide, they can get at as well. Right. So it was providing that, it was like a glue to connect it, but the MyDex data store on the other side was where that richness of information can be stored. So one of the challenges we were talking about with traditional electronic patient records is they're designed for a purpose, secondary care, primary care, or otherwise. They store data in fixed structures effectively. I know there are some text fields as well. But when we're dealing with data that's collected from a Fitbit or connected from, a sensor, a fall prevention sensor, how do you understand what that data is? How do you understand how accurate it is? You need some other way of storing that. And what we were seeing with that picture from Chal is potentially a mechanism by which that could be stored, and we could maybe process that. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Lady down here. Thank you. Lady in the yellow. Thank you.
Hi. I'm not sure whether it's actually a question or a comment, but I suppose the things that were going through my head as Scott was describing pod arrangement was that obviously a lot of us have encountered being quite uncomfortable with our data being, reused by Facebook, that type of thing. And we have our paranoia associated with somebody else being able to reuse that. But I think going through my head, I was also thinking, well, if you had to flip it on its head and then you pull it all into your own record, then surely that offers up other potential vulnerabilities associated with that information. The phrase from birth to grave or whatever it was you had on there struck a little bit of fear into me that if all of that was in one place and potentially I had access over who I make that available to, then that's one thing. but if it was threatened and not my choice anymore, what does that mean? And what has that meant to your engagement with people wanting to use this?
Great question. Scott?
Can you hear me? Yep, so that's fine. So I think part of this is, and we were very, very early on in the journey, but it's how you distribute it, because the concept with a pod is that you can have multiple pods, you could have hundreds of them if you want. So the security model on how you deploy that, these are all things that we need to sort of go through, but you're absolutely right. When we were looking at things like threat analysis and cyber analysis of those sorts of approaches, was like, if someone successfully phished access to your pod, they've got everything. So those sorts of things, we definitely have to have particular models, and I think how we split the data up across different services but still have control of that. So for example, within the Inrupt piece of work at the moment, Inrupt are the first people doing this, but they're still building it on the open standards, so then Apple and other people can come along and build those same sort of capabilities. And we'll end up having, similar to, say, a RAID disk array, with encryption and you know, separating this across different environments. There will be new models that need to come out to be able to protect us from that particular threat.
I'm just going to say something, but then Chris has finished sneezing. I might ask Chris as well. So I asked the same question to the Estonian team, because they've got 1.4 million people all on one system with every single piece of data you could want available in that structure. And I said, so your state-sponsored hacking, you know, do you not feel at risk in that particular way? And very much in similar to what Scott was saying, they have put forward, they've got a number of mechanisms to protect themselves. But I have to say two things. First of all, their structure was blockchain related. So it was public and private key related. And that inherently has a certain level of encrypted security with it. But secondly, and probably more powerfully, what they pointed out was the benefits for them outweighed the risk. And that was, they were honest about that. There is a risk. We're doing everything we can, but the benefits to society are so high that we would rather move ahead with that. Go ahead. No.
I don't really understand like how you can protect against that. But the DHI example, which was predicated upon open standards, you know, cloud of Rush, translated. I don't know, for some reason, it doesn't feel like as much of a threat.
No.
Because you're having to translate, you know, amongst different systems.
Yeah.
Out into something else.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the infrastructure that sits on top of the pods is almost a mirror image of that. So you're not just allowing direct access to the pod, you're running through a piece of middleware, which would be an API. So you have some sort of guardianship, which handles all your authentication, authorization, etc. So there's multiple layers to it as you start getting into it architecturally.
Chris, do you want to say something on this?
I guess you kind of picked up on the point, really, in terms of we as users all take an element of that risk to get that benefit. It's like using social media. We know there's a risk with that. We do what we can to try and protect it wherever we can, but we still use it because we want it. And that's where it comes back to that point in terms of if you're going to design this in a way where individuals have this access to their tool, you need to design it in a way where they're actually going to want that tool. And for me, that's really, really important, because if you just push this in someone's face, they're going to say, no, you know, it's not what I want.
Yeah, very true. The other little point, so I'll make two other points on that. I'll walk and talk because I'm good at doing that. Are you familiar with the NHS login front end on the NHS app?
Sorry, I missed that.
That's all right. Are you familiar with the NHS login front end on the NHS app? Are you familiar with, is anybody familiar with the NHS login? You are, Janet. Okay, so earlier on this year, we, as the NHS, launched something called the NHS app. You can all download it now. It's on the Android and Apple libraries. It enables you to book your appointments at your GP. It enables you to do your repeat prescriptions. It enables you to access a summary at the moment of your primary care record. So if you've got EMIS or System TPP, or you can access that. You can also do organ donations, you can access 111 online, or you can do your data opt-in or opt-out. So all of us, the citizens, have access to that now. Don't worry.
I'm in Wales.
You're in Wales. Okay, if you weren't in Wales. Actually, you could download it anywhere. But the important bit about it, it's available on the libraries. It connects into, as Scott was talking about, a host of back-end services that have been opaque to us as citizens in the past. It enables us not to have to ring up or go into the surgery and knock on the door and say, please, can you give me an appointment? Because I can see a slot and I can book it myself, thanks. I don't have to go in and beg for repeat prescriptions because I've already had that consultation. I can press a button and get it at the pharmacy. Or, as I say, I can access my record. Now, the reason I mention that is, and there was a colleague in the speakers bit, I was talking through the access process. NHS have created something called the NHS login program, which sits at the front. It's a bit more secure than the gov.verify system, deliberately so, and features two-factor authentication. On my one I've got on my phone, I can show you afterwards. If I put my biometric thumb on there, it will take me through and I can get access to my details effectively. The plan from the NHS is that is the front door for all of us. So when we go through our NHS login front door, all of the services behind that should be available to us. So we shouldn't have to log in, as Scott was saying, again and again and again and again and again. Because unknown to us, once we've been correctly authenticated, a token gets passed around that says I can access maternity information, I can access cancer information, I can access, because that's all cleared for us. That's the plan in terms of level of security. So it's worth just sharing that with you. If you weren't aware, that would sit as a front door. But still, even behind that at the moment, we've got the data held in lots of separate state-owned services, and we sort of play. What we're seeing with Scott, what we're seeing with Chow, is a fundamental change in thinking from the state owning the data, or controlling the data, truthfully, to the public, the individual owning that. And I think that's going to become more and more important in the future as we look to use that data for our own health benefits in future. Kind of out of time. Anybody find one? Gentleman over there.
Hi, I'd just like to ask Chris, you used a chart before, sort of those 4 quarters of things that people want. And there was one around where there's a danger where technology being introduced into people's homes could make them sort of less effective, if you like, in terms of the community, in terms of face-to-face. And you felt that a way to deal or to meet those needs was through social media and video technology and such like. And just something in the back of my mind says that there's some work done recently amongst young people with poor mental health.
Yeah.
And I think the statement was something like, never have young people been more connected, yet so many of them feel lonelier than ever.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering whether you've got any evidence, any research to show where we could overcome some of the problems that seem to be introduced by communicating in that particular way.
Yeah, sure. So the interviews that we've done, so Carrie, who works for me, has been out and carried out the interviews, and the interviews that we've done are from an age range of 17 right the way through to 80. Quite a significant broad spectrum. Particularly from the older generational side of things, it's not necessarily about social media, it's about social connection to friends and family. So it's less about clicking through a news feed of what's everyone's amazing life look like, more about how can I speak to my mum at a click of a button, or my daughter, or whoever it might be. And for them, it's been really, really important. And there are products out there right now. I mean, even we as users probably use FaceTime, for example, with our family. But the older generation, in some cases, don't know how to use FaceTime. It's too complicated. It's too small on our devices. And so there's products out there right now that, in my opinion, have quite a short shelf life, but a really important shelf life for those particular users. And I say this all the time to people that I go and meet, is that, you know, we as a generation right now, we probably all in this room have a smartphone. We're not going to put it down when we hit the age of 70, 80 and say, I don't use that smartphone anymore. I'm an older person. We're going to be more digitally enabled, and that's why I say kind of the technology that's being released right now is maybe a shorter shelf life, but actually the methodology behind that particular technology will be the same in what we use when we hit that age, but we'll just be more digitally enabled in that sense. And fundamentally, the main important bits behind it are that connection to family and friends, and going out to community events and stuff like that. That's particularly a lot of the feedback that we got back from individuals where they felt socially isolated and wanted to have these kind of meets that they could go to. So the dance that I mentioned earlier is a typical example of where an individual gets herself out of the home so that she can remain independent but also connected, so she doesn't feel lonely.
Any more? We're actually 5 minutes over, so I should actually call it, unfortunately, much as I'd love to continue. Thank you very much for being our small but very engaged audience. And hopefully, I'd like you to thank the speakers for speaking, please, today.